Right. Well, anyway, ministers have reportedly pushed back against calls from scientific advisors for new measures to tackle the Omicron variant before Christmas.
Yes, according to The Times, around one-third of the Cabinet are reluctant to support new restrictions in the coming days, with Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Chancellor Rishi Sunak among them.
So this comes after Health Secretary Sajid Javid refused to rule out further COVID restrictions for England as Omicron cases continue to soar. Nearly 83,000 COVID cases were reported yesterday after a week of record highs.
Yes, while speaking this morning, the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab was asked whether or not there will be further restrictions before Christmas. And Mr Raab replied by saying that evidence is being reviewed on an hour-by-hour basis, but that the public should use common sense judgment on who they're mixing with.
Yes, well, let's talk now to Matthew Lesh, Head of Research at the Adam Smith Institute, a neoliberal think tank and educational group. Gus, good morning. Happy Monday to you. I take it you weren't out and about this weekend then, were you?
I was not out and about. In fact, I'm at home isolating at the moment.
Oh, no.
With the dreaded Omicron variant.
Are you feeling OK?
I'm feeling much better today. A few days of headache and fatigue got me down, but I get up again.
Yes, someone should write a song about that, shouldn't they? So what do you make of the potential for more restrictions going into Christmas, over Christmas, maybe just after Christmas, based on where we are now with this variant?
Look, I think I'm pretty angry. I think a lot of people are pretty angry about the prospect of putting themselves into another lockdown. We were told in July this was it. We were going to learn to live with COVID. We've got vaccines, we've got antivirals, we've got all sorts of other treatments we can use to tackle the virus. We have a new variant. Yes, there's a large number of cases, but what we know from South Africa, from all the published information, is that is not leading to the severity of virus we've seen previously. It's leading to far fewer hospitalizations. When people are in hospital, they're spending less time in hospital, and there's a lot fewer going into ICU and onto ventilators. So I just don't think the case has been made for the need for more restrictions. At the same time, if people want to take responsibility for themselves, if they want to minimize their social interactions, but I think a lot of people are already doing in the run up to Christmas, all power to them. But I think the era of mass restrictions very much should have already come to an end. And I'm extremely disappointed that the government is, by all reports, going down that track today.
And it's one thing the government sort of bring that into force, isn't it? And it's another thing trying to actually enforce it and trying to get the public to comply. Again, this morning we showed our viewers the pictures there. The Prime Minister's on the front page of The Guardian and other newspapers because he had this business meeting / garden gathering with several other people during the lockdown. Do you think all these things, the parties, these pictures coming out, they're going to affect compliance this time round? Because a lot of people will say, well, why should I listen to Boris Johnson when he's not even following the rules?
Yeah, look, if Boris Johnson can't even follow the rules in May 2020, when we were probably in the heart of a lockdown and some of the worst death tolls imaginable, then what responsibility do people have? What are the chances people are going to follow new restrictions at the end of 2021 and the start of 2022? I think there is going to be a lot less compliance, whether it's because of Boris or just because people have had enough of all this. People feel like they want to take their own life, their own hands. They don't want another lockdown. Now, of course, I don't know how many pubs and restaurants are going to open in contradiction of the rules, but I think you're going to see a lot more socialising than you did during previous lockdowns, a lot more non-compliance. We have to ask ourselves, in the past, there was a good justification for lockdowns. Maybe you disagree with it, but there was a good justification in the first lockdown. Let's not overwhelm the NHS. The second lockdown, similar justification. We also were told we're waiting for the vaccines. We're waiting for them, enough people, particularly the vulnerable, to get vaccinated. This time around, there doesn't seem to be a clear logic or justification or endpoint to new restrictions. If there's new restrictions, once they go, the COVID will again spread through the population. So all you're doing is slightly slowing the spread. You're actually not stopping it or achieving very much in the process. So people aren't going to see a reason to follow the restrictions, and you're going to have a lot less compliance and a lot less effectiveness as a result. Yeah,
I'm assuming that you may have had a chance to have a look at the interaction, I think we could call it, between Fraser Nelson and the chap from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Graham Medley, where it did appear to suggest, anyway, that they were only really interested in modelling for SAGE and the government based around worst-case scenarios, and they hadn't actually even considered implementing a study that might show that Omicron is less virulent and less dangerous and less deadly than Delta. How do you feel about that? That does imply a few certain things, doesn't it, I think?
I mean, it fundamentally implies a corruption of the scientific process. The scientists are meant to model scenarios, various scenarios about what could happen with the virus. And the response we saw from the head of SPI, the head of the SAGE subgroup responsible for modelling, was we're not interested in modelling scenarios that don't need government response, that don't require decision. In fact, you would very clearly argue in indecision, choosing not to act, choosing not to lock people down is a decision. And the scientists should be presenting all sorts of different scenarios based upon the best possible evidence. What they've instead appeared to be doing is saying, we're going to provide the most optimistic view. We're going to provide a view in which Omicron is as deadly as Delta, despite the fact that we know from all evidence it's very unlikely to be as deadly as Delta because we have pre-existing immunity, because it might potentially be less deadly in and of itself. But what they can do is they can provide the most negative scenarios, and then they're going to step back and say, oh, it's not our responsibility for what happened next. We're going to leave that to the politicians to decide. The problem is, every single time they put out these scenarios, it's effectively taken by the media as predictions of things that's going to happen. And the government takes action on it because they've got this extraordinary pressure building up. And then the scientists step back and say, well, that didn't happen because you took all this action. I mean, this completely failure to do the most basic thing you would expect in modelling. If this was the private sector, all these people would be sacked by now because their models never come true. The companies they work for would have lost millions and millions of pounds because the models aren't there, because the models aren't speaking to any kind of meaningful reality. I want to see the government very much have a red team approach to this, where there are alternative models, where people are putting forward different approaches, different questioning all the assumptions being made, and we were actually making decisions based upon the cost and benefit. The other interesting part of that exchange was from that particular professor, Medley, was the fact that he said that he just assumes someone else in government is also considering the costs of lockdown itself. That there's another modelling team doing the cost benefit. There isn't. We know there is no proper cost benefit analysis on all this kind of modelling and lockdown. Yeah. And as long as that's going on, I think we've got to really question why the government is relying on this very one-sided, very doomster, gloomster view in order to take away our most fundamental liberties and rights and cause so much economic damage.
Well, Matthew, Lesh, thank you so much for all your input on that issue. Head of Research at the Adam Smith Institute. I think